Hey, good afternoon, John Donovan.
How you doing, Marty Keller?
I'm doing great. It's good to see you, and I understand you're on the road, so not
Yeah.
in your normal perch there in Oceanside,
No,
California,
I'm
but I'm in my normal perch here in Sacramento, and I'd like to welcome those of you who have been following the Intentional Living podcast that John and I have been doing for 5 years now. And if you're brand new, we welcome you here for the first time. If you're returning, we're glad to see you. Please hit the subscribe button and help us grow our audience here on YouTube. The Intentional Living Podcast is where we take a look at behaviors that we feel stuck in, behaviors that we are um, producing that we say in our conscious minds we don't want to do, and yet we keep doing them over and over again. We find
Mhm.
ourselves in this mystifying place where we feel compelled, we feel stuck, we feel almost like a prisoner when we do things that we say we don't want to be doing. Like we might say, "I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna have another cookie this week," and the next thing we know, we have a cookie stuffed in our mouth. Or could be a could be a drink of alcohol. It could be anything. It could be about how we behave toward our loved ones, and we say, "I'm never going to raise my voice to my wife
Right.
or to my children," and next thing we find ourselves yelling. So there's a behavior. There's a split between our conscious minds and our subconscious mind where that actually those compulsive behaviors are generated, and that's what we do here in this podcast. Is we explore how this works in the human being, and we explore how to change it. Because it
Right.
doesn't do any good to know this stuff if we don't also have a solution for creating something different, something better, something that's in alignment with what we consciously want to do. So that's what we discuss here on the Intentional Living Podcast. John Donovan, as everybody knows, but if you're a newcomer, you may not be aware, has invented a process or developed a process that we
Mhm.
call the accountability practice. And it's within this intentional living process. So we talk about how does that work? What's going on in our minds when we have these mystifying behaviors, and what is the solution? And today we're going to talk a little bit about, or we're going to start our conversation anyway, talking about one of the pioneers of the psychological insight about childhood trauma, and that's the Swiss psychologist Alice Miller. Alice Miller, who was prominent in the latter part of the last century. I think she died in 2011. Um, and she wrote extensively after her clinical work with adult patients who were having the same problem that we're talking about. They were finding themselves with compulsive behaviors, often self-destructive behaviors that
Mhm.
they consciously did not want to be indulging or engaging in, and they found themselves doing it. And so John has read, I think, John, you were saying you've read most of her major works. I've read about
Mhm.
half of them. And I've been reading one. This is sort of what made me want to raise this today. I've been reading one of her books called The Body Never Lies. And that title caught me in part because we've used Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, as a way of beginning to study or appreciate the uh, um dynamic of unresolved childhood trauma or complex PTSD,
Mhm.
or the PTSD of a thousand paper cuts, as I like to call it. And so I thought we could just start this conversation by maybe if you'd be willing, John, just to give the newcomer here, somebody who may not be familiar with Alice Miller, just an overview of your experience and what she has to say and what you've learned from her. And then there's some things we can drill down on in this particular book.
Okay. I was introduced to her in the book Drama of the Gifted Child. And I heard somebody talking about it that it was actually written for therapists. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it kind of perked my interest. I want to know what the therapist knows.
Sure.
So I read it, and it's not an easy read.
No.
She outlines the process in the dysfunctional family and and she ties it into the culture or the societal sanctioning of child abuse. She used examples like putting a piece of coal in a Christmas stocking as a way to learn a lesson, or um, physical violence is against children in the name of discipline is sanctioned, or isolation, or um,
Yeah, I remember it
scared.
in that book. Didn't she go after the old saying, "If you spare the rod, you spoil the child."
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I've got a different take on that. And hopefully, we'll get into it later. But she outlined all the ways that, and she was in 2011, so she was in alive during the Second World War and the German occupation and all this stuff. Um, so it gave me pause to widen my view of my dysfunction and how it blends into the society I live in, and how there's a term in the violence cessation class that I use is collude. In other words, talking to somebody else, justifying my behaviors and violent behaviors or addictive behaviors or whatever the behaviors are that are I want justification in, or validation. Oh, I would have done that too, and it's rampant. It's like so. I do my personal work, which I know now affects that whatever community I decide to be in. Um, One of the things I did with my children, instead of telling them what to do, I created the intent to exemplify for them how I wanted them to live. And that's with integrity, dignity. Um, so she was a major, major influence in how I understood my own recovery. And then how, when I built this body of work we're calling intentional living, she was a major influence in that too. So,
One of the things that she says, again, given that she wrote these books in the latter part of the last century, let's see, what year was this one? This is so this is copyrighted 2006, so the first part of this century. Um, she really goes after what she considers to be this collusion that you talked about. She like
mm-hmm.
you said, she didn't use that word, but she went after the fact that as a society, and she's basically, I think you're talking about Western culture in general, um, we overlook, ignore, or even condone the treatment of children that can be considered traumatic.
Yeah,
That we as a culture turn a blind eye to this. And one of the things that kind of caught my attention, and this goes back to what you were saying about the drama of the gifted child being written for therapists,
mm-hmm.
is how I don't know what it's like today, but for most of the American therapy training, this work is not included.
Correct.
I
Yeah,
remember,
go ahead.
okay, I just remember when I first got into therapy in my 30s after I'd moved to San Francisco, I was working with this therapist for 5 years before he ended up going to Betty Ford to deal with his cocaine addiction and discovered 12 steps.
Oh, wow.
He didn't even know about the 12-step process, which
Wow.
is, and he took me to my first adult children of alcoholics meeting, which is all about accessing and healing childhood trauma.
Oh, wow. Uh,
So that's I think Miller is very vocal about the failure of the therapeutic world, put that in quotes,
she was that
um,
too. Yeah.
to study this and incorporate the lessons and insights into the therapeutic process.
she would. I remember she went on the Phil Donahue show, and there's several therapists in the audience, sitting in the front row that were poo-hooing her, debunking her, telling her she's, off track. And I don't know if she was ostracized, but she struggled in her own field to get other therapists to have the insight that she had. And that's the case. I'm a drug and alcohol counselor, and I don't consider myself as somebody who counsels people. I offer them information about where they find themselves based on the concept, the idea that whatever's manifest in your life is coming from you subconsciously or consciously, either way, both parts of you. Um, and Gabriel Mate holds this view also, um, that any dysfunction or discordance in your life as an adult is a direct result of unresolved complex post-traumatic stress. And that's his bottom line. Why? Why am I doing what I'm doing?
Right.
Family of origin dysfunction, childhood trauma. Why am I an alcoholic? Why do I obsess about things? Why do I find myself screaming and yelling when there's really no, I'm not in alignment with what's going on around me? Um, 10 degrees higher than in intensity than anybody else. Or why do I find myself leaving a situation that is pretty um, simple, and yet I find myself not able to maintain my composure? And the answer to all of those questions is my unresolved subconscious complex post-traumatic stress. And most of the stress um, is nonverbal. It's pre-verbal before I learned how to speak. And then as I was learning language, 2, 3, 4, 5, I didn't have the words to express what was going on inside me because nobody mirrored that for me. If my grandson, I asked him to do something and he says no, or um, becomes resistant, I will feed back to him what I believe his, like, frustration. I see you're frustrated. I'm hearing you say you don't want to go with me to the store. But I feed it back to him so he knows that whatever he was doing was in alignment with where he found himself. And where he finds himself is learning emotional regulation, impulse control, frustration tolerance, and impulse control. So I nurture that instead of punish that. And that's what Alice Miller talked about, that punishment was the golden rule. Spare the rod, spoil the child. And I got a lot of that from the guys in the jail. We talk about violence and violence to children or spouse. And they would say, well, in the Bible it says, spare the rod, spoil the child. And in my recovery, I've learned to interpret these Bible verses differently than I had from my dysfunction. And what I've learned about that phrase specifically, the rod is a unit of measurement. It's a tool to measure things. So it's a measurement. So if I spare measure my own measurement, my integrity, I spoil my child. And it's not about corporal punishment. It's about, I say integrity, well, accountability about my own perceptions or my own beliefs, questioning that if what I believe to be true in the moment is actually the truth of what could be or ought to be. So,
Well, that brings us to one of the things that features in this book, and the body doesn't lie, the body never lies, is she goes after the commandment. I think it's the fourth commandment, honor thy father and thy
Mm,
mother. And she says that strict and mindless adherence to that commandment is part of the cover up that we have created in Western Christian culture. That when our parents are the authors of or the sources of childhood trauma, they treat us in ways that are emotionally, physically, or sexually violent.
yes.
We're still required to honor them, and that the requirement of honoring them means that we have to be silent about what actually happened. We have to swallow it. We have to eat it. And what we know from psychodynamics is that when we do that, we eventually become that.
Yeah.
We eventually become that which oppressed us.
Yeah.
And so it'd be interesting to get your take on how can one read. Well, what are your thoughts about her saying that? Let's just start there.
Part of we talked about this before the session here, and part of what I heard you say, she said in the book, um, is that either we should be allowed to hate them or we should hate them for what they did.
Right.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Um,
basically what
and
she's saying is it doesn't make sense to be told to love somebody whose experience with us we whose treatment of us we experienced as hateful.
you just you're back.
Yeah. Did you hear what I said about her?
You started to explain it, and
Okay,
then
so
you
she's
froze.
basically said, we apologize to people watching for the little technical glitch. She basically said it doesn't make any sense that we should be told to love people whose treatment of us we experienced as hateful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
And therefore we should be free to hate the people who traumatized us rather than pretend that we love them.
Okay. Yeah. And this is her interpretation of honor their father and their mother. Okay.
Yeah, so but to be fair to Alice Miller, what the way I understand it is she's saying this is a cultural norm that is getting in the way of healing.
Yes. Yeah. And the alternative is to go against that norm, which
Right.
honor their father and their mother means obey. One of them is obey. Don't hold a grudge. Don't judge. Um, my interpretation of this, just like the spare the rod, spoil the child. Um, I read a book one time about the Lord's Prayer in Arabic, and then how it could be translated from Arabic, and
You
it
mean
was
Aramaic?
from Aramaic. Yeah,
Yeah.
Aramaic. Thank you. And it was way different than the English interpretation of the Lord's Prayer. And it was more, I want to say, inclusive. It was just way different in the concepts um, that people interpreted. The same way with spare the rod, spoil the child. The rod is an instrument of measurement. So if I neglect to measure my own integrity, then I spoil my child. That's how I interpret that. Honor their father and their mother. For me, um, to honor them would be for me to become my authentic self. Is to bless them for their um, choice, willingness, sacrifice of having me and raising me, so that I could go out into my community as a positive advocate, change agent, and add to my community my uniqueness, my authenticity, my insights, my views. um, so that the community would be safe, which is way different than what I'm hearing her interpretation is. Um, it's almost like be subservient to them. And my interpretation is, well, it actually includes them. I've done a lot of forgiveness work around both of my parents. Um, my father first, he was the obvious one that needed forgiveness because he was drunk and brutal and physically violent. And then my mother, they did the best they could with the information they had, and they didn't have concepts like intentional living or childhood dysfunction or childhood trauma. PTSD wasn't even coined, I think, until
Right.
the Vietnam War in the 70s. So they did the best they could with the information they had. Um, and I can honor them for that, honor them for doing the best they could. And then don't use that as an excuse why I'm not. It's like, I was raised by dysfunction. Yes, I was, and I intend to heal. I intend to, one of the intentions I came up with is I intend to live the adventure that is my life, not their life. And me, I'm pre-recovery. I was in that category of hate. I didn't like my dad. I didn't want to be like my dad. I was disgusted with my dad. So the more I hated him, didn't like him, or was disgusted by him, I found at the age of 45 that I was just like him. It was what?
I had the exact same experience.
It's like, oh my God, how did that happen? Well, the answer to that question is hate. Hate, that's what I was focused on. So that's what I saw, and that's what I became. Um, so forgiveness for my parents has been a huge blessing. It's like I created the intent to forgive. I don't know if I wanted to forgive,
Right.
but I created the intent to forgive, and then I was blessed with the experience of forgiveness. It's almost like it came to me from outside of me, from my higher power. It just kind of washed through me. And the way it happened with my father was I was doing to him in my imagination. They say in the 12 steps, write a dead letter, and, get your anger out. And instead of writing a letter, I just did it in my imagination, and I was like beating him, berating him. And in the middle of that, I saw his inner child, and everything just went away. I saw his innocence and his wounding, and oh my God. And I had compassion for him. And I found out that the forgiveness that I felt had nothing to do with acquiescing to him. It was a break from his energy so that I could concentrate and focus on my life and what I saw as value to me. So,
I wonder if there's another additional way that we could interpret this. The honor our father and mother. Could it also be this? We could interpret this to mean to honor the truth of who they were
mm-hmm.
and honor the truth of our experience with them without condemning them, but also without becoming them.
Right.
In other words, I think part of the thing that Alice Miller is urging us is to stop pretending that we didn't have these traumatic experiences that we actually had,
I agree. I
to
agree.
acknowledge them. And I think the challenge, I had this challenge early on when I started this work with you. Not about you, but it's like to be able to, I had a hard time. I had a hard time saying that these things happen and that these things happen in the family that I grew up in, and that my parents were the vessels of these. They were the authors of these behaviors that impacted me this way.
Yeah.
Because I had that, I raised Catholic. I had that honor thy father and mother thing. And if I say they did things that harmed me, it felt like betraying them.
Yes.
It felt like it felt like I was creating committing a mortal sin,
Yeah.
almost like
Yeah.
blasphemy.
Yes. For me, it was like what I just had it saying that like whoever was talking to me about this was saying they didn't love me or I didn't love them,
Right.
which was not true. I believe my parents loved me, and they loved me the only way they could through the filter of their own dysfunction.
Yeah.
And I was found myself loving them back with this honor their father and their mother stuff. This I call it displaced loyalty, toxic loyalty to my parents, instead of just stating the data, just
Right.
stating the truth. And that's where the accountability process comes in. I could just state the truth. My father was brutal. Nice deep breath. Yes. Without blame or judgment. And then that left me with a feeling tone, the truth that released something. It's just like it validated without blaming or judging. And then I found myself coming up with, I intend to live the adventure that is my life, which I think if they heard me say that right now, they would be excited. They would be glad that I was like in this. Yeah, yeah.
It's almost as if the word validate in the context that you just shared it is another word to say honor.
Yes.
Honor thy father and thy mother might be, we could render that validate thy father and thy mother.
Yeah.
So if I validate myself and I validate you and I validate my parents, I'm not enmeshed. That's the opposite of that. I'm essentially saying I honor who they were. I acknowledge what happened. No blame or
Mhm.
judgment, as you said. And I honor and validate who I've chosen to be, including the gifts that they gave to me by being
Yeah,
by
that's
by
a
by
whole
being their child.
right. That's a whole nother podcast right there.
Yeah.
They get
Well, we
into.
are coming to the end of this, and I'd like to see if we could talk about more next week to get more deeply into this, because this is really important to somebody in recovery, particularly anybody just starting out, is to learn to tell the truth about what happened and to not do it without blame or judgment, so that it doesn't become a hate fest of our parents. And this is a tricky thing, and it does deserve its own time. So
Right.
maybe we could get into that in greater depth next week.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, great.
All right.
Well, for those of you again who have just joined us, maybe for the first time, the accountability practice is, we haven't got into the details of it today, but we will next week. The accountability practice is a method by which we can learn the source, and John talked about it, the family of origin, dysfunction, childhood trauma. We can feel that on the inside of us. That's not some abstract idea, although the way we talked about it could seem abstract because we didn't get into any specifics. But it's specifically a feeling inside of me that leads me to do these behaviors that I talked about at the top of the podcast, that I'm doing stuff that my mind goes, don't do that. And I do it anyway.
And do
And
it.
the accountability practice is a very simple practice. It's literally a practice. It's about feeling the truth of what's going on inside of me, and then taking a deep breath and stating what I want instead, if that's what I don't want. And
Right.
then putting that into the form of an intention, which is it's kind of a prayer. It's kind of an instruction to the higher power to start delivering, like, say, serenity or self-validation or whatever it is that we actually want.
Mhm.
So that's our process. We do it in group. A group setting is a much more powerful setting because we have a number of enlightened witnesses, which is a term that Alice Miller uses.
Mhm.
Um, and every enlightened witness sitting in a circle around me uh, multiplies exponentially the power of love that I'm offering to myself when I own the truth of
Right.
my own experience and behavior. So we have 4 meetings a week that are all on Zoom and in different times, different days. So all the information on the timing and the Zoom addresses to join us in one of these meetings will be at the end of the podcast. We invite you to join us and check it out for yourself.
Yeah.
And with
Yeah.
that, John, I thank you very much for your time, and
Yeah.
we'll pick this conversation up next week.
Thank you, Marty.
You bet. Take care.
Mhm. Uh-huh.